Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. This week, I'm taking more viewer questions, and we're going to start with Martin, who asks over the Patreon, what is the constitutional difference between electricity transfer across provincial boundaries and oil transfer? Newfoundland seems to have been stymied by Quebec on electricity transfers, so I've been struck by your consistency in pointing out that oil pipelines are a federal matter as soon as they cross the provincial border. Okay, there is a long and somewhat complex legal history between Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador on the electricity rates and what was generated at the Lower Churchill. So back in 1969, the province of Newfoundland and Labrador signed an agreement with Hydro-Quebec that lasts until the year 2041. They signed a very particular price point, flat rate, and then the electricity market changed. And so Newfoundland has basically been getting hosed by this bad contract that they signed, and they can't get out of it. They have tried in court so many times, and the court said, nope, you signed a contract in good faith, you get to live with it. So that's really what the difference is. Quebec has tried to argue that electricity is a provincial responsibility, so on and so on, but as you point out, anytime something crosses provincial boundaries, it is a federal responsibility. So that's why, pipelines that cross a provincial boundary, federal responsibility, no matter what BC or Alberta will try and tell you. And why the notion that you need to declare federal jurisdiction is bogus, because it's already federal jurisdiction. So in this case, there's no real difference between electricity or oil pipelines. It's just that Newfoundland signed a bad contract and they can't get out of it. And so that's kind of what's happened there. I've got a second question here from Martin, also on the Patreon, who asks, is there any historical reason for the, in his words, ridiculous facade in the Canadian House of Commons whereby the members must face the speaker when asking questions to the point of ignoring or never looking at the members opposite? This doesn't happen in Westminster, for example, where the PM looks directly across at the leader of the opposition when replying to questions. That one, okay, I tried finding some historical precedent and I couldn't really find it. Part of it is structural because they have the dispatch boxes at the center table in the House in Westminster, whereas in Canada, we have desks instead of benches, and so they can't actually get up and go to the dispatch box and look at one another in that regard. But what I was able to find was a section in the Rules of Order and Procedure and Practice, for the House of Commons. And in Chapter 13, under Order and Decorum, there is an actual section called Remarks Addressed to the Chair. And basically, it says that the principle is that members must address the chair and not a member or the gallery or the TV cameras, because the basic principle of procedure in the House is that they must be conducted in a respectful manner, and they're less apt to engage in a heated exchange or personal attacks if their comments are directed to the chair than if they're directed at one another. So that's the reasoning behind it. I tried digging into seeing where that particularly came into effect in Canada, where it doesn't in Britain. I wasn't able to find that, but that is the reason that's listed in the giant Bosque and Gascon, I think it's called these days. So there we have it. Our next question is from Patricia Trouble over on the Twitter machine. And Patricia asks, remind me again, what are the rules governing Vice-Regals and their appearances during an election cycle? So this is one of those things where it's all about the Vice-Regal needing to be neutral in these kind of situations. So Vice-Regals can still do the kinds of things that they need to do in terms of going to community groups and doing kind of patronage activities in that regard. Meeting with dignitaries or so on, but they need to be conspicuously absent from any kind of campaigning. And that also means not showing up at events where political leaders will be at, and so on. And I don't know that there are any hard and fast rules about it, but it's largely just judgment calls in terms of they need to be seen to, be safeguarding their neutrality, because if there's a hung parliament after the election, they will need to make a judgment call one way or the other. So they want to make sure that they are safely removed from that. We just saw a case in Newfoundland and Labrador during their last election where the leader of the opposition accused the lieutenant governor of campaigning or of some kind of quasi-campaign activity for the Liberals at one point, and basically it turned out she was visiting this community because her mother was there. This had been a pre-existing arrangement that had happened, and it was more of a case of coincidence and just bad timing than anything. And I think that said leader of the opposition, Ches Crosby, did eventually apologize to her honor, but that's one of those things where they try and be very conspicuously absent in any kind of thing like that. Patricia also had a sub-question here of, is it just me, or are just the Conservatives advertising right now, and what's the strategy on waiting? Part of that is there are spending limits in the pre-writ period as well as the writ period, but campaigns are largely trying to save their war chest for the actual writ period. The Conservatives, however, are have fundraising coming in hand over fist, so they've got money to burn. So that's why you'll see more of their ads in this pre-writ period than you would during the actual election period itself. Our last question is also from Twitter, and Marika Ellick asks, do you feel that social media has changed our perception of politics and those involved in it, as in politicians, advertisers, and journalists, and if so, in what way? Tough question. The short answer is yes, it has changed it. It's harder to kind of explain in what way. Part of it is that we're seeing a lot more of these actors, whether it's politicians or advertisers or journalists, in a way that we never used to. So we never used to get the kinds of things from politicians, for example, when they're either out at community events as they happen, as opposed to maybe a roundup in a newsletter once a month. So we're seeing a lot more immediacy of that kind of thing. We're seeing a lot more just things being personalized in a way that we never really did pre-social media. The other thing we're seeing is a lot more proliferation of, I don't want to use the fake news, but it's just the kind of narratives and disingenuous things that were much more difficult to distribute pre-social media. I can remember the whole things that would come across fax machines back when I was much younger, because I'm old. But when email chains would go around, and I would have situations where my mother would forward me stuff, and there was something like, this Liberal MP has a private member's bill that reached second reading, and it would give immigrants social benefits where they wouldn't used to be, and isn't this terrible? And I would have to go and explain things like, private members' bills will probably never be debated. First reading is pro forma, so it being at second reading, it means nothing. And having to debunk things. That viral meme about refugees getting more than senior citizens. That's another example of things that have been weaponized over social media that we didn't really see a lot of previous to that, or when we did, it was much harder to distribute and for people to pay attention to. So that's part of how social media has changed the landscape. It makes misinformation easier than misinformation used to be. So that's also making jobs of people like me harder because we have to try and both present what's going on and also debunk some of the stuff that is being said about it at the same time, so that we can ensure that there is an accurate portrayal about what is being said or what is happening. So, it has changed it. At the same time, I don't know that all of the changes have been necessarily negative, because we're seeing some levels of engagement which have been a lot more positive, and ways in which we can reach out to MPs that we never used to be able to, or to journalists in cases. And so that's something I think that has its positives as well as the negatives of, you know, the trolls and harassment and so on and so on. So yeah, it's changed it. I don't want to say that it's all for the better, and I don't want to say that it's all been completely for the worse, but it certainly has changed it. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith, and that's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.